Hello and welcome to Roundtable. The first joint military exercises since Russia's attack on Ukraine saw China and Russia fly bombers over the Sea of Japan and the East China Sea. Is this a strengthening of a strategic alliance as the United States rallies partners to counter China's rising presence in Asia? Or is it a sticking plaster for an alliance under strain? Very good to have your company. I'm David Foster. More than 3 months after Russia's attack on Ukraine, China has yet to condemn Moscow. Despite Beijing's misgivings, its joint exercise with Russia would suggest that the partnership is not waning despite a rising death toll in Ukraine. But Russian officials are becoming increasingly frustrated, it is being said, with China's apparent refusal to provide more support, both moral and financial, to Moscow. The Washington Post has said, citing unnamed US and Chinese officials, Beijing wants to expand assistance for Russia, but without running foul of Western sanctions, while Moscow, for its part, wants China to live up to its no limits pledge. So what is the point of the military exercises? We head to the eastern part of the United States and North Carolina, and there we see once again Professor Klaus Larres, Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Then to Geneva, and we welcome back Paul Vallet, historian and international relations specialist, who is an associate fellow at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. With me in the studio, Stephen Chan, Professor of World Politics at SOAS University of London. Jolly good to see you. I'll come to you in just a moment, Stephen, because I think you're going to give a bit of an overview here. But Klaus, I want to go back to something that you mentioned on our program in March, and putting this into context. So we're talking about Russia and China here, but it all involves, in terms of where we look at it, what is happening in Ukraine as well. And you said the conflict, will only benefit China if Russia wins quickly. So what has happened now? But is 100 days too soon to be able to say whether it's long or short, or where China stands in relation to Russia and the conflict?
Well, the war certainly isn't short. I think a lot of people, a lot of countries are hurting because of the war, not least, of course, the civilians in Ukraine, but also the global economy and most major powers. And it also applies to China. China doesn't like a prolonged war. It tests its relationship with the West. It also tests its relations with Russia. The Russians, for example, have asked for a lot of economic support from China, financial support. And I hear there have been 2 rounds of very tense discussions between the Russians and Chinese, because the Chinese don't want to give too many issues and too many items which may fall under international sanctions, while the Russians, of course, want more and more because they are getting very desperate regarding their economic and financial situation. So the prolonged war has certainly not helped anyone, including the Chinese. And China traditionally likes international and global stability, particularly, of course, economic stability. And the turmoil in their own country with the lockdown in Shanghai, the supply chain disruptions because of COVID, all that has made life for them difficult as it is. And the Ukraine war contributes to that.
So I have to ask, why are China and Russia doing this together at this particular time? We're going to bring up a map that shows what happened off the east coast of China. There was South Korean airspace that the jets flew over, then into what is deemed to be Japanese territorial waters. So invading both the airspace and the territorial waters of those 2 nations. What kind of statement was it making, do you think, Klaus, about the US support for Ukraine?
Well, China has been particularly sensitive about Taiwan for many years. It is increasing and escalating. American support for Taiwan is increasing as well, at least certainly from a Chinese point of view. And they want to make a point. They want to declare that Taiwan is part of China, that the United States in particular shouldn't meddle, and that also applies to America's allies in the region, like Japan and South Korea. So it clearly is a threatening movement. but it doesn't mean that the Chinese are about to attack Taiwan or are about to invade Taiwan. I don't think that that is imminent at all. In the media, we see reports that the Chinese will use the Ukraine war and the distraction of the United States by the Ukraine war to then launch an invasion against Taiwan. I don't think that is the case. The Chinese are interpreting the war and analyzing the war regarding what it means for their Taiwan policy. And I think the two lessons they have arrived at is, if you do invade Taiwan, you need massive military force, and you also need a good policy to avoid international sanctions or not to be touched by international sanctions by being economically self-sufficient.
So I'm going to stop you for just a moment, if I may, because I want to bring everybody else in early into this program. And Stephen, I'm going to ask you about the timing of this. Was it deliberate because of what's been happening in Ukraine? And secondly, if China is looking at what's happening in Ukraine and trying to learn lessons vis-a-vis potential conflict in Taiwan, will it have worked out a reasonable strategy?
The timing was deliberate, but not in the sense that most people imagine. It was deliberate because President Biden was in the Asia-Pacific region having meetings with senior leaders from that part of the world, India, Australia, Japan, the so-called Quad group. And it was a deliberate signal to the Quad group, we're still here, we're still part of the frame, we're still in the game. Now, in fact, they've been doing exercises with Russia for many, many years. And before the Ukraine war, but within the last calendar year, China and Russia had both naval exercises and land exercises. This air exercise simply completes the trio, as it were. And it wasn't a particularly large aerial exercise.
Well, partly because I suppose Russia's got so much of a commitment elsewhere in Europe.
That's right. They've committed a very great deal of material, a very great deal of equipment in Ukraine. And the one lesson I think that the Chinese would have learned from the war is that if you are going to invade a place like Taiwan, they would have learned this from the Russian difficulties in Ukraine. You better have a bloody good logistical supply chain. And that's almost impossible to achieve when you're attacking an island fortress like Taiwan.
And in fact, the coastline of Taiwan is very, very difficult. There are only a few areas which, as I understand it, it would be possible to sort of have any kind of beachheads on.
Absolutely, and very heavily armed. And the Taiwanese soldiers are very heavily drilled in the whole idea of repulsing an invasion.
Okay, well, we'll come back to sort of what motives China may have when it comes to Taiwan with regard to what's happening in Ukraine. But Paul, I want to come to you now and ask you about where China stands with regard to Russia, because in a sense, what it was doing, it was burnishing Russia's tarnished credentials in Ukraine, if you like, by saying, A, we can fight alongside you, and secondly, look, the Russians aren't quite the spent force that many people might think they are. Look at what we can show you.
Yes, I certainly agree what my colleagues just said. When we have to point out that we are in regular drill season that countries of either side are going to conduct no matter what. So yes, certainly there was I think an incentive for the Chinese to show off their particular capacities, in particular because, well, in this sort of a relationship, obviously they are somewhat like the pupils learning from the earlier acquired long-range air and maritime capacities that the Russians have. Now, of course, in the region they have the major surface fleet, and in a way they do have, I think, a logical incentive to show off their capacities. Whereas, as was pointed out, the Russians will have had to send a number of the units that are normally based in the Far East and in the Pacific and in Siberia. And many of these units have actually been engaged on the Ukrainian front with the results that we've all heard about. And so for them, the idea is, of course, to show the Chinese that even if they have had to send a substantial part of their forces over to a different front, they want to show that they remain an effective military performer in the Northern Pacific.
Okay. I'll throw this one out, and whoever wants to can pick this one up and run with it, because I want to now examine, if it's possible, how the relationship between China and Russia has changed, if at all, since the start of this conflict, when we had President Putin and Xi Jinping both saying that the relationship between the two was one of no limits. Who wants to start?
I think that you can have all the rhetoric in the world, like no limits, but in fact, the Chinese do have a limit. And this would have been evident in behind-the-scenes discussions between the leaderships of the two countries. I don't think the Chinese like what's happening. They understand the Russian motives, but because it disturbs the international equilibrium at a very delicate economic time for China as well as for many other countries, and in fact worsens the economic climate for a very great number of countries that China depends on, in Africa, for instance, for friendship and diplomatic alliances, I would say the Chinese are very, very behind the scenes unhappy with Russia.
And then we have, as you said, Russia's asking China for more money, it's asking it for weapons. Does China feel like it owes Russia anything?
They'll make gestures of support. There will be some material forthcoming, some finance forthcoming, but not a very great deal, as my colleagues today have said. The Chinese have got problems of their own right now, and the Russian losses are actually huge. When you look at what they've lost on the battlefield, the Chinese can't resupply all of that.
Okay, Klaus, let me come to you on this one. No limits was the phrase used by Biden and Xi Jinping, but that can work any way you like, can't it? It can be no limits when it comes to what we want to do together as the best of friends, or also no limits when it comes to stabbing somebody in the back.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, as just was said, it's sheer rhetoric, that placates the domestic public. It sounds good for the international public, but does it really mean anything? Someone, a clever analyst, has called the Chinese position towards the Ukraine war and towards Russia as pro-Russian neutrality. And I think that is actually a very good term, because the Chinese try to be neutral because they don't want to be hit with sanctions. They don't want to deteriorate relations with the West even further. But at the same time, they also want to show some sort of support to Russia. And they do help the Russians, but only in respect as these things are not hit by sanctions. For example, the Chinese-Russian pipeline, which will eventually by 2025 deliver Russian oil to China, is progressing, and work is done very, very busily on that pipeline. Also, the Chinese are supporting Belarus economically, so they are trying to do what is possible without being, falling under international sanctions. But they don't like the war. They would like to see the war finished as soon as possible. And perhaps another last point, we know now since the Ukraine war, and we always knew it to some extent, but we now know that Russia clearly is the junior partner to the Chinese. Before the war, we had that inkling, but no one wanted really to admit it. But now it can be seen by anyone who wants to look, because Russia is totally dependent on Chinese geopolitical support, on support in the United Nations, and in the last resort, also regarding economic and financial aid, possibly military aid, if the Chinese were ready to provide that military aid, which at the moment they are not.
Stephen's touched, Paul, on what China's losing while this conflict goes on. And I want to bring in something now from the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Zhao Lijian.
Recently, the US has been spreading disinformation against China in regards to the Ukraine issue, time after time with sinister intentions. China's position on the Ukraine issue is consistent and clear, and we've always played a constructive role in persuading peace and promoting talks. It is imperative that all parties exercise restraint, de-escalate Zhao Lijian tensions rather than exacerbate them, and push for a diplomatic solution rather than further escalating the situation.
Do you reckon, Paul, that China is worried about, let's say, the food supplies that it's got from places like Ukraine and from Russia, the oil that it perhaps gets and needs for the expansion of its economy? Will that really hurt China down the road unless there is a diplomatic solution?
It seems clear, and I think I'm in agreement with my colleagues on this, that both Moscow and Beijing had an evident interest in the war being concluded as swiftly as possible, and that's not materialized. So, so to speak, what we're first going to see probably are traces, perhaps of not China hurting so much, but a certain embarrassment that is going to creep in probably in the statements and in the behavior. Obviously, as Klaus mentioned, the dependence of Russia is something that, of course, bolsters Chinese confidence, but at the same time, asking so much of it that indeed it comes at a particular moment, especially with the COVID lockdowns that had perhaps probably not figured in the advanced planning of the situation, but have affected China's capacity.
And if China is hurting by the fact that this has not been over in a matter of weeks, as Moscow might have wanted, will it have the ability to put any pressure on the Kremlin to de-escalate, to come to some kind of peace agreement? In what way will it be able to show its displeasure?
Well, it's an interesting option, considering, how much discussion has been made even around the West about, how can Russia be persuaded to actually accept less than what it went to war for? And would it be an irony if it was through China that this was delivered? But of course, that's going to be a very delicate exercise for the Chinese to exercise in any kind of public way, because obviously their shared interest is really to maintain the united front as much as possible. And so for China to be able to actually have some leverage on Russia in a way, the military situation in Ukraine has to start going a little bit more of Russia's way for China to have any sort of a track to follow in this direction,
Okay,
I'd say.
so China doesn't want sanctions. Therefore, that's one reason why it's not wanting to get too heavily involved with Russia. But it also wants the conflict to be de-escalated. But it's tricky for China to say so publicly. It has to be something that's working behind the scenes. Klaus, what kind of pressure, leverage would China have if it got tricky for it, really tricky for it?
Yeah. I think we should also bear in mind that Xi has developed an ever stronger anti-American attitude. He really wants to bring down American hegemony as he sees it in the world. And I think that unites him with Putin. That is what they both share very deeply. Also what China needs from Russia is, of course, oil and other resources, and also grain and wheat deliveries. And I don't think that China and Xi want to cut off their last line of getting these essential products from abroad into China, because China, as we know, is a huge country. It needs all these things in abundance. Therefore, there is only so much Xi is prepared to use against Putin. And at the beginning of the conflict, a lot of analysts hoped that China would actually mediate in the conflict by putting pressure on Putin. But that is not happening. I hear there might be some talks behind the scenes, but they haven't, of course, led to anywhere. And I think it's a matter also for the Chinese of perhaps losing face. If there were public talks, if China was seen as a mediator and it didn't work, it was a failure, how would China look in the public eye? And I think the Chinese don't like to lose face very, very publicly by having failed in their mediation effort. Instead of that, I think they're not going to do that. And I don't think we can expect that the Chinese will, in the end, bring heads together and actually be instrumental in overcoming the war.
Is Russia listening to any of this, do you think?
Russia is certainly sitting up and taking notice because it's hurting a very great deal because of this war. Its losses in specialist manpower, for instance, reveal all kinds of weaknesses. The number of generals who've gone down, generals who shouldn't have been anywhere near the front line, basically playing the role of colonels. So what's going on in terms of the structure of the Russian military, never mind its actual strategic performance? So all of this would be carefully noted in Moscow, that the war machine is actually not functioning as it should have, and diplomatic and economic pressures keep building. The Chinese are talking to the Russians, but not in public, as Klaus says, very much behind the scenes, and no doubt pointing out, look, how much longer can you hurt like this? before you come to some kind of viable approach towards peace negotiations.
What's your estimate now, as opposed to 3 to 4 months ago, on the capabilities of the two military machines, that which is run by Moscow and that which is run by Beijing? Will China have learned some lessons, or was it already far ahead in terms of what it was capable of, or what?
China would have learned lots of lessons that it has to upgrade its electronic capacities on the battlefield. The Russians broad front bombard everything in sight without too much by way of precision. That is something which is a blunderbuss approach, which the Chinese would have seen doesn't have great efficacy, particularly when you're trying to win hearts and minds in an urban warfare setting as well. So a very great deal of refinement of military strategy is going to have to take place in China, as well as, of course, in Russia. And the Chinese will be just taking careful note. They've got actually quite good think tanks now, much better than they used to be, and they would be very much analyzing what's been going on and trying to learn lessons for the future.
Let's, Paul, we've only got a few more minutes left, actually. Let's take this, say, a year, 18 months down the line, or maybe even sooner than that. And China is thinking that it wants to create a one China country and bring Taiwan into that. That would probably be the way that it wants to put it. Will it be less likely to launch an invasion then than it was before all of this? Or will it think, hang on, we've seen what Russia's done wrong, we can learn the lessons and we can do it this way, our way, and be successful?
If you look at it from a purely Chinese national interest point of view, certainly everything militates for the Chinese chain of command to look at very carefully at everything that has gone not to plan in the way that Russia conducted its invasion of Ukraine. Obviously, the challenges of mounting a seaborne invasion of Taiwan are also a very different particular operational setting than land warfare as we know it between Russia and Ukraine. So there are really daunting challenges that China has to look at. And of course, it has to contend with the fact that there's probably a reinforced front of resistance that may come. Well, certainly Taiwanese determination will not have diminished. There's a probability that the United States will have also found creative ways of supporting Taiwan, let alone the possibility that they might eventually decide to support it in very direct ways. There are the other Asian countries, Japan, Australia, South Korea as well, that are also going to be joining with NATO at the end of this month at the Madrid summit. So China is going to find itself, facing a very strong front. So they really have to think twice about their decisions.
Indeed, they may think twice and then think a third time and think this is the right thing to do, because the similarities between what's happened in Ukraine and what could possibly happen in Taiwan are, Klaus, that these are both possibly emotional conflicts. The greater Russia, in the sense of what Putin said he wanted to do with Ukraine, and the greater China when it comes to Taiwan.
They're deeply emotional for both countries, absolutely. And Taiwan, for Xi, is really the issue in his foreign policy. He wants to go down in history as the man who brought back Taiwan into the motherland, or at least bring it as close as possible. But we have to keep in mind he wants also to be re-elected in October, so-called re-elected, for a third term as party leader. And that will influence his policy at the moment. It's difficult to guess in what way it is influencing him, but it will have an impact. So we may see a slightly changed Chinese policy after October, once Xi has been safely re-elected, which we probably have to assume, and then he may feel more at liberty to take whatever action he feels needs to be taken regarding Russia, regarding the Ukraine war, and perhaps even towards Taiwan. So I do not expect anything really bad happening regarding Taiwan in the near future.
Quick wrap up, Stephen, and apologies for making it so brief. Are we less likely, in your opinion, now to see escalating conflict in Southeast Asia than we were before this, or more likely now?
I think the Ukraine war makes it less likely that the Chinese will want to go down this route. They've seen how difficult it is. They don't want to get themselves involved in a mess like that. Basically, Russia has taught China a lesson not to make hasty decisions about invasion.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much indeed, Klaus. Thank you, Paul. Stephen, always a delight to see you, particularly in the flesh after having interviewed you down the lens for so many months. Good to have your company. And thank you wherever you happen to be watching this edition of Roundtable. I'm David Foster. Until next time, well, we hope there'll be a next time for you. Goodbye.